Tonight on the Worldview Weekend Hour, is the system already in place that allows for a social credit score that will determine whether you have a job, can keep your job, or have the ability to travel? We know this goes on in China. It's called a dangan. But Americans might be surprised that for many, many years, many of us have been warning about a very same system being put into place. Tonight, we'll tell you about it on part 10 of Brainwashed America. The Worldview Weekend Hour begins right now.
WVW-TV presents the Worldview Weekend Hour with Brannon and Howse. Whether the topic is law, science, government, economics, history, family, social issues, education, or theology, Brannon brings the issues of today into clear focus through the lens of a biblical worldview. And now, here is your host, Brannon Howse.
Good evening and welcome to part 10 in our series on Brainwashed America. It's good to be back with you after a little bit of a break, and we'll pick it up right where we left off. Tonight, I'll be sharing with you how the social credit score system has already been put into place over many decades that will deprive many conservatives and Christians and people of faith, from certain privileges. A system that is already being put into place that will bring persecution. It's called a dangan in China, and your hiring and firing and job promotions and ability to travel is all based on review of an applicant's dangan. Here in America, it will be a social credit score, but it will involve many years. It will involve many years of having tracked the worldview of America's students, as many of the elite bragged, from cradle to grave. And then you add in the national ID card. Many states are already giving out the national ID card that it comes with a strip on the back of it and a computer chip that houses lots of information, including private data. How might the national ID card, combined with a social credit score, combined with the tracking of a student's worldview from the beginning of school all the way through their life and career, be used not only in America, but on a global scale? If you'll remember, a few weeks ago, we discussed Betsy Devos, Secretary of Education for the Trump administration, who signed America onto a program through Agenda 2030, the United Nations. And she boasted that there was going to be the merging of labor and education, the departments of labor and education, as I've been warning about since the early 90s. And she admitted, and those that worked on this admitted, that many of the things they would be tracking would be a student's attitudes, values, feelings, and beliefs, and they would follow them from school to career. Well, you'll see tonight that I've been warning about that for many, many years, back to the 1990s, and even in my second book, which I thought I brought with me, but I guess I didn't, my second book, Reclaiming a Nation at Risk, it came out in 1995. Tonight, I'll show you some pictures from where I spoke at the school board meeting in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Hamilton County was the county, school district, Chattanooga. And I was warning then about a plan that was being put into place. Well, that was the model for the nation. And would you be shocked that one of Hillary Clinton's friends was involved? And it was about tracking a student's attitudes, values, feelings, and beliefs, and giving students a certificate, working in conjunction with business and government to give preferential treatment to those who had obtained the right effective objectives, attitudes, values, feelings, and beliefs. I'll show you how I was treated when I went to Chattanooga in March of 1996 and warned that this system was coming. There was about 1,200 parents in attendance, and I received several standing ovations that night. In fact, we have the entire presentation on video. It was being simulcast on local access cable that night. But while I did receive a standing ovation many times from the taxpayers, from the parents, the fake news media, the liberal media, the cultural Marxists, they were not so kind. I was compared to a terrorist who came to town with a gun in his belt, or the blacklisting of the 1950s, or the extremism of the Ku Klux Klan. By the weekend, they were drawing cartoons of me. You'll see some of that tonight. I don't know that I've ever shared this on television and showed this on TV. I built it into a PowerPoint to share it with you tonight. So let's get started. Part 10 on America Brainwashed, or Brainwashed America, Part 10. Remember, we're on Part 4 of a 10 10-step process for brainwashing of people. And remember, we have studied the prisoners of the Korean War, the American prisoners during the Korean War who were brainwashed and how they did it, largely without drugs or torture. We've also studied the people of China and the communist Chinese Revolution of 1949 and how they were brainwashed to go along with communism. And we're looking at what I believe are 10 steps that I have found in my research that shows how it was done in China, how it was done to our POWs in the Korean War, and how it's being done and has been done on Americans for many, many decades. And so we're on step 4 of a 10-step process. Teach the importance of group consensus and collectivism and the danger and consequences of individuality. So let's continue on this, then we'll get to point 5. The goal, folks, does not have to be to get people to agree with communism. The goal does not have to be to get people to actually become communists, I should say. That doesn't have to be the goal. The goal is not necessarily to turn them into communists, but it is to teach them a political correctness, a cultural Marxism, a liberalism, a collectivism that does not oppose communism. You see the distinction? The distinction is this. They don't need you to become a communist. They just don't want you opposing communism. As long as you go along to get along, that's just as good as someone becoming a communist. And so the goal doesn't have to be communism, but teaching people collectivism, non-judgmentalism, in other words, open-mindedness, moral relativism, utilitarianism, which is the concept of the belief in moral relativism, or what is best for the group, not individual liberty or rights, but what is best for the group, what gives the best outcome to the largest number of people, what gives us pleasure. And if it gives us pleasure to steal from one to give to another, and that's the best for the group, then so be it. It's also called liberalism. Well, in 1959, U.S. Secretary of Agriculture for President Eisenhower was Ezra Taft Benson. And in 1966, he described a revealing conversation he had with communist leader Khrushchev. By the way, folks, you can hear this audio of Ezra Taft Benson describing this himself in one of the hours of Sabotage the Movie. Remember, there's 6 hours of this movie, Sabotage the Movie, how the Islamists, Marxists, and their useful idiots are destroying America from within. 6 hours. You can watch the first hour for free at sabotagethemovie.com, sabotagethemovie.com. And you'll hear Ezra Taft Benson in his own words saying this, quote, "Your children will live under communism," Khrushchev said. "On the contrary," said Secretary Benson, "my grandchildren will live in freedom, as I hope that all people will." Khrushchev replied, "You Americans are so gullible. No, you won't accept communism outright, but we'll keep feeding you small doses of socialism until you will finally wake up and find that you already have communism. We won't have to fight you. We'll so weaken your economy until you fall like overripe fruit into our hands," end quote. Indeed, is that not what's happened and is happening? And many of our children and grandchildren have fallen over into the hands of the communists like overripe fruit. Oh, it's maybe not called communism. Again, maybe it's called things like collectivism, non-judgmentalism, moral relativism, utilitarianism, or liberalism. The end is the same. You don't have to be a communist just as long as you don't oppose them, as long as you go along to get along. Well, Richard Wurmbrand in his 1966 congressional testimony warned about the dangers of going along to get along, and he warned about the churches in America that would embrace socialism or communism under another name, liberalism. Don't forget, Richard Wurmbrand spent 14 years in a Romanian communist prison. And when he came to America within months of being freed, he was testifying before a congressional committee. It was the most sold government document for the next 3 years. Don't forget also, the Romanian communist freed him because some folks had purchased his freedom. But they warned him upon his departure that if you leave here and you go and you trash communism, we will pay someone to kidnap you and bring you back, or we may just hire some thugs to murder you. Well, Richard Wurmbrand would not be deterred, and within months he's speaking before a congressional committee, and as I said, it was the most sold government document for the next 3 years. You ought to read it. You'll find it online. But here's one of the things he said, quote, Romanian communists are very excited in the fact that you have here in the United States or in the States something like 300,000 liberal clergy on their side. They can't very well win them for communism, but they can win them for a left-wing Christianity which supports communism, end quote. Well, we know today there's much higher numbers than 300,000 liberal clergy. But notice what Richard Wurmbrand says. They don't need to win you for communism. They just need to win you for a left-wing Christianity that supports communism. So whether we're talking inside the church or outside the church, the communists don't have to convert you. They just have to convince you. They have to convince you to go along, to be open-minded, to be more relativistic, to be non-judgmental, to go along, to get along, to not oppose them. William E. Mayer, in his speech in November 27th, to be precise, 1956, declares, quote, and by the way, remember, William E. Mayer was the medical doctor that was tapped by the U.S. Army to study the POWs coming back from the Korean War who had been brainwashed, re-educated to go along, to get along, to not oppose the communist worldview. And many of them, again, went along without drugs or torture. They simply did not have the education necessary to destroy the arguments of the communist. And many of them, when they came back, said, if we had only known. And don't forget, they were brainwashed largely with propaganda, fake news, revisionist history written by the communists at the Jefferson School in New York City that was then sent over to the communists there in Korea and used with our POWs. Literature written by the communists in America. And the POWs were put in rows and lined up in a formal classroom setting and indoctrinated with fake history, revisionist history, propaganda, fake news, information operation, political correctness, cultural Marxism, class envy, whatever you want to call it. And that's what goes on today. And William E. Mayer warned in his speech in 1956, quote, they weren't trying to make communists or spies or security risk or anything like that. They were simply trying to plant some of the ideas that in the long run are going to help them. And they were trying to pare down the character traits of individuals, which are the severest roadblock toward the progress of communism in any group, end quote. What were they trying to do? Destroy individuality, destroy the individual, destroy their character, their ideology of being Americans and proud Americans, and defending our system, our constitutional republic, and our way of life, our free market system. Destroy them as individuals, destroy their character, destroy their integrity, and destroy their individuality, and get them to go along with the group. Pare down the character traits of individuals, he said. Well, in a statement on March 13th, 1958, before a U.S. Congressional Committee on Un-American Activities, Ed Hunter had this to say, and I'll remind you that Ed Hunter was a journalist who had formerly worked with the government and had studied the people of China and how they were brainwashed to go along with the communists when they took over China in 1949. And in his congressional testimony in 1958, Edward Hunter says, quote, a great proportion of people in the POW camps, as in any communist country, did not believe the red line and never did believe it. We should not regard this as proof that the communists failed, which some of us are doing, but as indication of the communist technique. They never expected the mass of soldiers to be communists. They didn't need them as true believers. It wasn't necessary, end quote. Well, Edward Hunter not only studied the people of China and how they were brainwashed, but he, like William E. Mayer, studied the POWs, our American POWs, and what happened to them during the Korean War. And he said, again, as William Mayer said, they didn't need to become communist. They just needed to be educated to go along. Edward Hunter continues, Hungary has shown an example of a population which appeared satisfied with red control, seeming to believe in its doctrines. In Hungary, we saw overnight the people who acted and talked as if they were communists revealed themselves as unbelievers, furiously fighting to the death with their bare hands against communism. Yet, such a population is pointed out as pro-red. What is important to the communist hierarchy from its power standpoint is that others act and talk as pro-red. That is what happened inside the POW camps. Very few people in any communist country are red. We should never forget this. The Reds believe basically in power. in what individuals say and what they do. So long as people do what they are told and go through their verbalisms and motions attached to belief that is satisfactory to a power fraction such as the Kremlin constitutes, end quote. What's he saying? He's saying many people will claim that they're pro-red, pro-communist, when in reality they're not. They're just going along. And the communists don't care if you really are a communist. They don't care if you really believe what they believe, just as long as you say you do. As long as your actions are in accord with communism and you don't fight them, they are happy to have you within their camp. And he says that indeed this is what was going on in Hungary. And maybe you're not familiar with the history of what happened in Hungary. Hungary was taken over by the Soviets, by the communists. But in 1956, there was a revolution, at least an attempt at a revolution. It only lasted a few short weeks. But the students there in Hungary rebelled against communism, and they began to protest in the streets. And then the communists killed one of their fellow students. They wrapped his body in a flag, and they hoisted him above their heads and paraded him around in the streets. And the protest then grew larger and larger and larger. And this went on for a few weeks. And in that time period, it is said that many people who were opposed to communism would run into other people in the streets taking part in the revolution that they thought were pro-communist. And they were stunned to find them in the streets joining in the attempted revolution against communism. As Edward Hunter was pointing out, it isn't that they were in favor of communism. It's that they went along to get along, just as Mr. Hunter warned. They went along to go along. And again, Mr. Hunter uses Hungary as a specific example. And my friends, I am sad to say that this broadcast will likely be watched many years from now when America has succumbed to socialism in its entirety. When we are under a system of universal health care, single payer, where the government is that single payer, and it is the government that will decide whether you have treatment for a curable disease or problem. And under this universal health care system, everything will be known about you. Your file will be there to be reviewed by the government. Who you are, what you believe, your worldview, your attitudes, your values, your feelings, and your beliefs. And I'll show you tonight where they will get much of that, where they have already gained much of that data. But this will put a chill on freedom of speech. This, among many other things, will put a chill on freedom of speech because now your ability to get along means you have to go along. There will be rewards and punishments for those who comply and don't comply. And so, if you're suffering from prostate cancer that is curable, are you going to speak out against the government? If the government has the ability to give you the cancer treatment that you need to cure your prostate cancer that was detected early on, are you going to be a vocal opposition to communism, to the government? And so many will go along and you will think, well, there must be very few of us in America that oppose socialism or communism or Marxism. But trust me, the vast majority will not be in favor, or at least a big percentage will not be in favor of it, but they will be afraid to say otherwise for fear of the consequences. And this is exactly what happened in Hungary when those opposing communism would run into people in the streets they thought were surely pro-communist, only to find them in the street joining in with the attempted overthrow of the communist. No, they had just been playing the game and going along because that was what was expected of them if they wanted to live a somewhat normal life. And so after the failed revolution, this man, Jonas Cotter, took over General Secretary of the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party. And he was there from October of 56 to May 1988. And he's notorious for saying, quote, "He who is not against us is with us," end quote. In other words, as long as you're not against us, we'll consider you for us. Used to be said, he who is not for us is against us. No, that's not what he said. He changed it to, he who is not against us is for us. You may not agree with what we're doing. You may not agree with socialism and communism, but as long as you're not against us, we'll consider you for us. And it was a pretty much a more accepted idea under his leadership to not agree, but as long as you kept it to yourself, even if it was known you don't agree, as long as you kept it to yourself and didn't fight them, they'd leave you alone. And so what is being discussed by Mr. Hunter in Hungary is those who went about claiming to be pro-red, who in their hearts really were not, but they learned how the system worked. So they went along. Edward Hunter in his testimony says, a certain element must become deeply indoctrinated, especially those who have thrown their interest irrevocably into the red camp. And these constitute the activists, the hard core of the party. They're a small minority. And the constant purges, even in their ranks, show how untrustworthy even these are. In any area under communism, so long as the Reds are able to maintain a controlled environment and are indisputably in power, the population comes to talk and act as pro-communist. The people will follow orders, even to the expression of the communist point of view. That is how it is in any communist country and how it was in the POW environment, end quote. So many within the POW camp openly spoke pro-communist as Americans in these POW camps of North Korea. And this was very confusing to many of their fellow POWs. And so many of them then were convinced to go along and play the game. And so the majority of them did not oppose communism because remember, those who were reactionaries had already been moved away out to reactionary camps, and that was about 5% of the POW population. And so that group consensus comes into play, and people begin to follow what the group does. No longer the will of the individual, no longer individual liberty, individual freedom, but that of the group. And as long as the group is going along, others will be enticed to go along as well, and the die is cast. Edward Hunter went on to say, quote, the red objective against the United States is not the conversion of the American people to communism any more than it was to make true communists out of the American prisoners of war in Korea. The objective of all communist conquest is simply use for power. They seek to conquer the United States in a manner so that it voluntarily falls into the red orbit. If we have to be conquered by destructive nuclear age weapons, it will be considered a setback by the Kremlin. Their objective is to make the same use of the American people as they make of the Czechs and the uranium mines in Czechoslovakia, and as they make of the Chinese and the mills of China. We are to become subjects of a new world order for the benefit of a mad little knot of spots in the Kremlin, end quote. Folks, again, Edward Hunter speaking in March of 1958. And this is true with what we see today. Here we are in May of 2019, and Putin does not want to use nuclear weapons on America. Even though Putin speaks to the Communist Youth Party and speaks of being proud of the communist worldview, he doesn't want to use nuclear weapons on America if he can avoid doing so. He wants to take over America, as do the communist Chinese, and turn us into their slaves. To take our property, to take our minerals, to take our natural resources, and to use them for the benefit of their empire. And so once again, the goal is simply to get people to go along so they can take over without having to use force. And that was done in the POW camps. And unfortunately, that's also being done on an international scale. They don't want to use nuclear age weapons. They want to have us simply fall over into their hands as overripe fruit, as Khrushchev predicted. And that doesn't mean you have to become a communist. That means you simply have to join the group consensus and stop thinking like an individual and become a part of the group and not oppose their worldview. Well, remember, we're on step 4 of that 10-step process for brainwashing. Teach the importance of group consensus and collectivism and the danger and consequences of individuality. So what America needs now are leaders. Leaders committed to individual liberties and not group facilitators committed to collectivism. Today, we don't elect leaders, we elect politicians. We don't elect men of character, but men of convenience. We don't elect men for moral principles, but self-interest. And leadership has been replaced by popularity. So this does not bode well for America, because we have redefined what it means to be a leader. We've redefined key definitions and terms. It used to be that someone that was intolerant could be a compliment. Someone that had discriminating taste, that could be a compliment. One that is intolerant of evil, one that is intolerant of violation of civil liberties, one that is intolerant of big government, one that's intolerant of socialism, one that is intolerant of theft of private property. That would be a compliment, but not today. Intolerant is now one of the greatest sins there is, along with non-judgmentalism, which brings us this idea we have to all be tolerant, except of the conservatives. So words have been redefined. Someone who had a discriminating taste, yet today, if you are discriminating between what is right and what is wrong, you're judgmental, you're intolerant, you're a hater, you're a bigot, you're a racist. And so the fact of the matter is, this leads to us electing people who are not leaders, but who are compromised and who are furthering the cultural Marxist agenda. Point 5 in our 10-step process for brainwashing: set up a system of rewards, honor, recognition, and advancement for those who embrace the worldview and values of the brainwashing program. Let me say that again. Set up a system of rewards and honor and recognition and advancement for those who embrace the worldview and values of the brainwashing program. William E. Mayer in 1956 in his speech declared, if you want to play baseball in a communist society, you've got to understand something. You don't get educated a few hours a day and the rest of the time you go around developing your personality like we do in our country. You get educated all the time. So if you want to play baseball, you don't play because you're a good pitcher, you know. You play because you're a progressive and advanced student. You're developing a good sense of social responsibility. You're becoming a member of the people. You deserve to play. And to demonstrate your deserving qualities, you take part in the political rally before the ball game starts, the rally during which you march around the field and carry banners and slogans and sing rousing old-fashioned folk songs like the Communist International. And then you get to play baseball. And after the game, another rally. End quote. He went on to say, quote, and the communist viewpoint was very clearly and categorically expressed to the effect that you and I, us average Americans, are number one, materialistic and opportunistic. He, the communist, said, the American will make a deal, always. He's got a price. You can buy this guy, make it attractive enough, and he'll do what you want, end quote. Well, in these two quotes by William E. Mayer, who studied the POWs coming back from the Korean War and how the communists were able to brainwash them, we find two things. Number one, that the communist rewards you. You want to play baseball? Then you go along and you say what we want to hear, do what we want you to do, and we'll reward you. We'll provide you with benefits and privileges. You don't just get to play baseball. You've got to earn the right. You've got to be a willing participant of the party, the Communist Party movement, our ideas, our worldview, our beliefs. And the communists there in the POW camps of Korea learned that little rewards would cause the American soldier to easily be controlled, to compromise. You can buy him. He has a price. Maybe it's something little, playing baseball. Maybe it's something else, a little better food. Whatever it is, that American, he has a price. You can buy him. In other words, he doesn't have strong moral values. He doesn't have a lot of integrity. He'll compromise his beliefs. He doesn't have the courage of his beliefs, or he doesn't have convictions or the courage to back up those convictions. You can buy this guy. You can offer him something. He'll join the group. That's what the study showed by our own government. And so, the communists today, in America and outside America, and on a global scale, have studied exactly what I'm studying. And they are mimicking the same process. And so they have set up a system of rewards and punishments. And they realize the average American can be bought. They realize the average American does not know what he believes or why he believes it, or the form of government that we have, or how to defend it, and why it's important, and what happens if it's done away with. They realize the average American will surrender their children to a communist worldview if we tell them it looks good on their college transcripts. The United Nations has figured this out, and they've been able to open, a few thousand UN schools here in America, as we've studied, called the International Baccalaureate. What they found out since the late 60s is that American parents will surrender their children's minds to them as long as you tell them they're going to get something for it. Advancement. You'll get a great recommendation on your college transcript if you join the UN school and begin to believe the communist, United Nations, collectivist, globalist, international socialist values. You'll get ahead. You'll get into the best schools, and American parents will willingly surrender their children's minds to the communist, the internationalist, the globalist at the UN schools because they're getting something for it. But it doesn't have to just be at the school level. It also happens at the work level. And so a system has already been put into place and is being rolled out even as we speak that will utilize this weakness in the character and integrity of the American people, their willingness to compromise, to go along for advancement, even the slightest little advancement. And don't think for 1 minute that social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and all these other things where people all show off what they have, their latest and greatest toy or vacation. Oh, don't think for 1 minute that won't be used to parade around that they're part of the group that's being rewarded. They're not part of the reactionaries who are being banished. Oh, they don't have to send you off to a reactionary camp, a literal reactionary camp. They can send you to a reactionary camp that is of your own making because you dared to stand up and had the temerity to speak up and speak out against their communist, globalist, Marxist ideology. And where will that find you? Well, without certain privileges. Maybe you lose your job. Maybe you can't get a job. You now don't have the ability to travel. All these things are being put into place. They don't have to send you to reactionary camp. They can just send you to, quote, Facebook jail, if you will. They can send you to a social credit score jail, where now you basically have a very difficult time going about life. Oh, no need for reactionary camps. Who wants to go through that trouble and that mess? Let's just put social credit scores together that punish people into compliance. Well, that's exactly what they're doing. And the communists found out they can buy Americans a long time ago. Here's the New York Times International, March 16th, 1992. A file open on each urban citizen when he or she enters elementary school, and it shadows the person throughout life. Moving on to high school, college, employer, the Dangan contains political evaluations that affect career prospects and permission to leave the country. The file is kept by one's employer, end quote. Folks, I quote this in my book in 1995, Reclaiming a Nation at Risk. I quote the New York Times International from 1992 in my book, Reclaiming a Nation at Risk, that I wrote in 1995, and I said this system is coming to America. And I was roundly mocked by not only Americans, but by the useful idiots within inside evangelicalism. The same useful idiots and the same kind of useful idiots that today are mocking the idea of our opposing not only the red of communism, but the green of Islam. Those that mock us for daring to lift up a shout against things like interfaith dialogue. And so, my friends, once again, we're seeing that it is Americans who have been warned, but who mock the warnings. And they, my friends, will see the light when it's too late. They will see the light when they feel the heat. and they will be the ones that scream the loudest. These, my friends, will squeal. They will squeal like a stuck pig. And yet they were warned years ago this was coming. They will scream and holler and carry on as if this is something they had never heard of before. And yet they were the ones who were warned decades ago, who joined in with the mocking and the ridiculing when folks like myself and others tried warning this was going to happen. Oh, this isn't a matter of my making the statement. You can go and get a copy of my book, Reclaiming a Nation at Risk, from 1995, and see that I'm quoting the 1992 New York Times International and warning that the Dangan system will indeed come to America, and I explain how it will come to America. And it has come to pass just as I predicted it would, not because I'm smart, but because I know the trends and have studied history and read their white papers and watched their conferences, even on C-SPAN throughout the many, many years. It's all out in the open for anyone to watch and understand who has eyes to see and ears to hear. March, New York Times International, March 1992, quote, the Dangan affects promotions and job opportunities. Any prospective employer is supposed to examine an applicant's Dangan before making hiring decisions, end quote. Here's a book I found, From Family to Market, Labor Allocation in Contemporary China. And here's what the book says. Each laborer, a worker, or a cadre has a permanent dossier, or Dangan, kept by his Danwei, this is like one of the people who oversees them, as the basis of evaluation. A typical Dangan collects 10 kinds of materials recording personal information on everyone, a resume and updates, an autobiography and updates, regular appraisals by superiors and peers, all sorts of test results, political history and investigation into that history, party and other associations, awards and honors, penalties and confessions, professional credentials, diplomas, degrees and certificates, and promotion or demotion records. Other materials include personal writings and reports, and ultimately eulogy and death certificates. Personal revenge, false entries, and special favors are thus part of the game, because a worker almost never gets to see his or her own Dangan. Their bosses, through this, have access to it, though, and acquire a tremendous and almost mystical power over the subordinates. Every state employee has to have a Dangan to be employed, transferred, or promoted. And yet here's an article from March 31st, 2019. China's social credit system. It's coming to the United States of America. Well, I'm glad they reported it in 2019, but I warned about that in 1995 in my book, Reclaiming a Nation at Risk. My friends, here is from the Holocaust Museum. This is a card, an identification card, an ID card of a lady, and it's stamped with a J. Now, the colors have faded, but originally that was a red J, and it stood for Jude, to mean a Jew. And they also had to add a new surname. If they did not have a Jewish-sounding name, then they had to add the name Sarah or Israel to their name, so they could be quickly identified as Jews. And so their ID card was stamped with a red J to identify them as Jewish, so that they could then receive the proper treatment. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum writes, quote, on October 5th, 1938, the Reich Ministry of the Interior invalidates all German passports held by Jews. Jews must surrender their old passports, which become valid only after the letter J has been stamped on them. The government required Jews to identify themselves in ways that would permanently separate them from the rest of the German population. And in August 1938 law, authorities decreed that by January 1st, 1939, a Jewish man and woman bearing first names of non-Jewish origin had to add Israel and Sarah, respectively, to their given names. All German Jews were obliged to carry identification cards or identity cards that indicated their heritage. And in the autumn of 1938, all Jewish passports were stamped with an identifying red letter J. As Nazi leaders quickened their war preparations, anti-Semitic legislation in Germany and Austria paved the way for more radical persecution of Jews, end quote. And my friends, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And I'm here tonight to tell you that the system is being put into place and has been going on for several decades now that will quickly and readily identify those as C, conservative or Christians. And frankly, it won't really matter. Whether you're marked as a Jew or a conservative or a Christian, they will identify you, and many will be marked with a C, conservative or Christian. And you will be punished accordingly. Now, just as there were Jews in Germany that went along, who were given positions of status, there will be many Christians who will compromise and who are Christian only in name or in heritage, in lineage. And they too will go along with the coming Reich. Reich meaning empire or kingdom. That's why I wrote the book in 2012, The Coming Religious Reich. Reich meaning empire or kingdom. And there will be many, quote, Christians that will go along with this system. And there will be many, quote, Christians that will be used by the state to bring about the persecution of real Christians. Just as in Germany, you go back and you will see there were Jews loading Jews onto the rail cars. But my friends, a system has been set up, and most Americans don't know it, that already identifies who they are and what they believe. Imagine if Hitler had at his disposal what the world planners have at theirs today. Here's an article. DeVos signs on to globalist UN education agenda. Grassroots parents call for her dismissal. Now, we covered this a few lessons ago, but I want to remind you what this is all about. U.S. Education Secretary Betsy Devos has signed onto a declaration by education ministers of the G20 countries that calls for putting education at the center of the global agenda, an action that has led a national grassroots organization of parents to call for her dismissal. The article went on to say the declaration, which was produced at the first gathering of the Education Working Group of the G20 governments and dictatorships, was titled Building Consensus for Fair and Sustainable Development, and calls for globalization of education, inclusiveness, social and emotional learning, and increasing data collection on students throughout their educations and well into their careers. End quote. Notice, folks, inclusiveness, globalization, education, inclusiveness, social and emotional learning. We're talking, folks, about effective objectives, attitudes, values, feelings, and beliefs. And who is going along with this? Christian Betsy Devos. Go do a little research on the Devos family. These are supposed Christians, and these are people who are patriotic and love America and want America to succeed. And who's going along with it? Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos. Just as there were Jews loading Jews, there'll be Christians setting up the persecution of conservatives and Christians. And Betsy DeVos, in my opinion, should be ashamed of herself. The article goes on to say, in her prepared remarks to the G20 education ministers in Argentina, DeVos brought forward her goal for workforce development or government management of the workforce, which the Trump administration has recently stressed in its proposal to merge the U.S. Departments of Labor and Education. Folks, that's a big mistake. And again, I warn about that in my book in 1995, Reclaiming a Nation at Risk, that this is happening, that it would continue to happen, and it's very dangerous and should not be happening. And folks, we just call them the way we see them, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And my guess is Donald Trump does not fully understand this, but if he would like for me to come to Washington, D.C. and spend 15, 20 minutes giving him a quick little understanding of this, I would gladly go there and do that at my own expense or over the phone. But people better be alerting President Donald Trump what this system's all about and the origin of this system. The article went on to say, the declaration specifically states the G20 education ministers are in line with the United Nations 2030 agenda. The article went on to say, in addition to urging digital literacy, the education ministers say they will foster the inclusion of non-cognitive skills such as socio-emotional skills across the curriculum, end quote. Again, we're talking about attitudes, values, feelings, and beliefs. Indeed, education and economy are indivisible, especially when given interconnectedness of the world today, DeVos said. DeVos said, emphasizing that while each child is an individual, government should approach education by acknowledging the realities of today's economy with an eye toward tomorrow's opportunities. Quote, so students must be prepared to anticipate and adapt, she said. Quote, they need to acquire and master broadly transferable and versatile educational competencies like critical thinking, collaboration, communication, creativity, and cultural intelligence, end quote. Well, my friends, who defines those terms? Who defines critical thinking? We've already seen by one educrat years ago, critical thinking means you don't listen to mommy and daddy. That's not critical. Who defines these terms? Critical thinking. You know, these sound a lot like what I found on a certificate of mastery back in 1994. This certificate of mastery traveled with me all over the country. I would put it in my briefcase along with other key papers, and I would speak, and I spoke in Oregon, and I spoke in Washington State, and I spoke in California, and I spoke in New Hampshire, and I spoke in Texas, and I spoke in Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and Illinois, and North Dakota, and South Dakota, and Nebraska. All over this country I spoke since the early 90s, warning about this system, and particularly since 1994, carrying this certificate of mastery with me and warning the system was coming when you would be judged or advanced or not advanced by your worldview, your political evaluations, your religious worldview, liberal or conservative. And now we have Betsy Devos furthering this concept as Secretary of Education as of tonight, May 2019. But notice what is on this certificate of mastery. The first one ever given out in Cottage Grove, Oregon, to Jay Tennyson. His mother was a friend of mine. She gave me this and knew that I was traveling the country and showing it. And this was, many people had copies of this. But this is the one I pulled out of my file and took a picture of it. And here it is. What are these objectives you must obtain to receive the certificate of mastery in Cottage Grove at the Cottage Grove High School in Oregon? Here's a bigger picture, more blown up so you can see. Involved citizen, quality producer, self-directed learner, constructive thinker, effective communicator, collaborative contributor. Now go over to the right-hand side. Quantify, apply math and science. What does that mean, apply? Understand diversity, deliberate on public issues, interpret human experience, understand positive health habits. Do you realize what those things mean? They may sound good to you, but let me tell you, the definition of those terms are not the definitions that we as conservatives would hold. As I lay out in my book in 1995, Reclaiming a Nation at Risk, and many of my books since then, including this book in which, again, I warn about all this in my book that I wrote in 2008, came out in 2009, Grave Influence. And so it became a test area. Oregon, Cottage Grove, Oregon. The state of Oregon became one of the leading places to test this certificate of mastery. Today, they don't call it a certificate of mastery. Today, they might call it tough choices or a dossier or a social credit score or a portfolio. They have all kinds of names. They don't have to call it a certificate of mastery anymore. The idea is that you will obtain the right effective objectives, attitudes, values, feelings, and beliefs, just as Betsy Devos said, Secretary of Education here in 2019, or what happens? Well, there's going to be rewards for those who achieve it. And no such rewards for those who don't. In fact, in March of 1996, I went to Chattanooga. My radio show was airing on a large Christian station then, WDYN. And I was speaking on these issues. And my book, Reclaiming a Nation at Risk, had just come out. And I was invited to speak because a lady named, I think her name was Helen Smith, a lady in her 80s. A lady in her 80s was listening to my broadcast and organized other mothers and grandmothers and said, the liberals have brought in a guy to speak on why this stuff is good. Let's bring in Brannon Howse to expose it. Let's get the school district officials to hear the other side before they enter into what I think was going to be about $1 million contract with I think what's called the Public Education Foundation to carry out Hillary Clinton and Mark Tucker's global education agenda as a part of what was America 2000, now called Goals 2000 under Bill Clinton, who was president at the time. Let's bring in Brannon Howse and let him give the alternative like he's doing on radio. And so this lady, I think she was about 80, Helen Smith, and her husband and others organized and promoted I would be coming in March of 96 to speak to the school board. They got the school board members to agree. And then they had so many people that were going to show up, they had to move it to a new building and then another building. And it was finally held at Red Bank Middle School in Hamilton County, Chattanooga, Tennessee. And there were over 1,200 parents in attendance that night. And we still have it on video. And before I arrived, here is the Chattanooga Free Press. There's a picture of my book from 95. Howse slams door in the Public Education Foundation. Went on to declare that my book was not accurate, did not have reliable data. Now, that's a joke because almost everything I predicted in that book in 95 has come true today. So even before I arrived, they were warning that I was coming to town to speak and that I could not be trusted and my data was not reliable. Well, here we are in 2019, and indeed, what I predicted is coming to pass. Here is the March 21st, 1996, Chattanooga Free Press. Schools hear critic tonight. Howse to give Christian view on merger plan. And you notice they're even talking about Goals 2000 right in the middle of the page there. Chattanooga Free Press, March 22nd, the next day after I spoke. 1,000 hear schools critic. Teachers group appalled. Yeah, there was standing room only, about 1,200 parents. I received several standing ovations. To the enthusiastic approval of most of 1,000 plus crowd, Goals 2000 foe Brannon Howse Thursday night criticized the local public education foundation and its director. And then went on to say the speaker, who was invited to the spacious Red Bank Middle School auditorium by the county school board, said a controversial Public Education Foundation committee plan for the merged city-county schools takes control away from parents and gives it to the government. Now, they invited the president of this foundation to debate me, but he didn't want to debate me, nor did the other guy. But I invited them to debate me, so I got the whole 90 minutes. But the article goes on to show that not everybody there was happy. However, not everyone in the audience was cheering Mr. Howse, a radio talk show host, commentator who is president of the American Family Policy Institute in St. Paul, Minnesota. That's where I was living at the time. Paula Petty, president of the Hamilton County Council of PTA, said she was, quote, upset and hurt, end quote, that the board, quote, would invite people from outside to come in and show that our opinions are worth so little, end quote. She said the, quote, extremism, end quote, of Mr. Howse was comparable to that of the Ku Klux Klan and the, quote, black list of the 1950s, end quote, saying she is a dedicated parent volunteer. Ms. Petty said, quote, in the last couple of weeks, I've been called a socialist. I've had my Christianity questioned, end quote. She asked, quote, will the next speaker be a terrorist with a gun under his belt, end quote, I guess referring to Gaddafi. Well, of course, these useful idiots, where are they today? I wonder how many of them were in favor of this when it was called No Child Left Behind under George W. Guess what we found? A lot of them were in favor of it under their hero, Bill Clinton, when it was called Goals 2000. But when George W. came into office and changed the name to No Child Left Behind, all of a sudden they didn't want it because George W. was for it. By the weekend, they were drawing cartoons of me. There I am leading the parade, House of Fear. Here's a letter, November 11th, 1992, to Hillary Clinton. And it's written by Mark Tucker. Mark Tucker is part of the National Center on Education and the Economy. This is the original document I traveled with all over the country. I still have it in my file today. You can see National Center on Education and the Economy. Put it out. Who is on their board? Hillary Rodham Clinton, Rose Law Firm. Who else? Speaker of the House, Oregon, Vera Katz. Now you understand how Oregon became the test model. The Speaker of the House of Oregon was on the committee for the National Center on Education and the Economy, which was calling for certificates of mastery, which is why we have the certificate of mastery first given in Cottage Grove, Oregon, as I showed you a while ago. We see that Ira Magaziner was involved, David Rockefeller Jr. We see that the whole idea, students get a certificate when they meet the standard, allowing them to go on. There was going to be a national system of education. This is all being tied to national, international standards in the UN. Reward students who meet the national standards with further education, good jobs, providing them a strong incentive to work hard in school. We would replace rules defining inputs with rules defining outcomes and rewards for achieving them. And these are all effective objectives, attitudes, values, feelings, and beliefs, just as you saw in the Certificate of Mastery from Cottage Grove, Oregon. Just even as Betsy Devos is admitting many of these are effective objectives. Former Assistant Secretary of Education Checker Finn said, perhaps the best way to enforce this standard is to confer valuable benefits and privileges on people who meet it, and to withhold them from those who do not. Work permits, good jobs, and college admission are the most obvious, but there's ample scope here for imagination in devising carrots and sticks. Checker Finn went on to say, as former Assistant Secretary of Education, driver's license could be deferred. So could eligibility for professional athletic teams. The minimum wage paid to those who earn their certificates of mastery might be $1 higher, end quote. I think he was Assistant Secretary of Education under Bill Bennett. So again, I don't care who's in power, an R or a D. You better watch what's going on. In 1997, then Governor Roy Romer of Colorado, while serving as a board member of the Goals 2000 panel, was asked how to enforce the national standards. He replied, quote, I believe if you were to get all employers of this country saying that they would not hire anybody unless we see a high school graduate certificate that has on it the results of this potential employee's record, then I think this nation will come to the realization that there's no job for them. There is no life for them. There is the motivation, end quote. Well, we saw in 1997, Pioneer Press, Minneapolis, St. Paul. They were going to do what? Lawmakers Going to get strict with teens. What were they going to do? Under bills now moving through the legislature, 16 and 17-year-olds could face driving restrictions if they fail their basic skills test. Well, here's the problem. What is that basic skills test? Affective objectives, attitudes, values, feelings, and beliefs, a social credit score. Yeah, there was a guy who warned about all this in 1995 in a book called Reclaiming a Nation at Risk. And folks, it's moving forward. And I also warned in that book, in fact, I warned in my book in 1993, Cradle to College. It would not only involve students, it would involve adults. How do we know that? Because the governor of Tennessee, who went on to become the U.S. Secretary of Education for George H. Bush, who's still to this day, 2019, the U.S. Senator from Tennessee, Lamar Alexander, said it would be for babies to adults, one-stop social service centers. He said there would be national one-stop centers for babies to adults, education and re-education. The government would project the supply and demand of the workforce and tell you what job you should hold and train you accordingly. And there would be a file opened on you. And if you do not embrace effective objectives, the right attitudes, values, feelings, and beliefs, you can forget having your professional license given to you or renewed. In fact, my friends, I have spoken all over this country. And when I've mentioned this, I asked how many of you hold a professional license of some kind? And many would raise their hand. And then I would say, how many of you have had to take a test to get that license renewed? And you had to agree to certain effective objectives as an adult to get that license renewed, be it a nurse, a lawyer, or a man that works on air conditioning and must have a license to work with Freon. And hands would go up all over the room and people would testify to their having to take a test as adults, embracing the cultural Marxism and political correctness of the globalists and the Marxists for that license to be renewed. And I warned in my book in 93 and my book in 95 that the system that was being put into place was not for students only, but eventually for everyone. We would be a nation of students, as Lamar Alexander and George H. Bush said. And next week we'll pick it up right here. And we'll look at school to work. And we'll move into the national ID card and the social credit score and how everything that's been put into place at the educational level to track their attitudes, values, feelings, and beliefs will continue and be a part of this social credit score. National ID card. No, you won't have to have a passport like the Jews did with a J stamped on it for Jew. But there will be a digital portfolio and it will be clearly stamped with your worldview as a Christian or a conservative. And if you don't prove that you're willing to sit down and shut up and go along, you will be sent off to a reactionary camp. Not a literal one per se, maybe that'll happen, but they don't have to send you off to a reactionary camp. They can send you off to, quote, reactionary camp, meaning make your life miserable until you decide to comply. And my friends, this is how you brainwash people. You don't have to turn them into cultural Marxist, into globalist, into socialist. You just have to destroy that individuality so they go along to get along. You simply have to offer up the rewards. And as the communists said in the POW camps of the Korean War, the American, he'll compromise. He has a price. So we'll pick it up here next week. And don't forget, your support makes this program possible. Can you imagine the hours it takes just to build the PowerPoint? Not to mention the study. And we put it out here to you free of charge. You wouldn't walk into a restaurant and eat a fine meal and walk out without paying, now would you? Well, my friends, we offer you up a free, wonderful diet, meal, buffet of truth regularly. And folks, we can't do it without you. The streaming, the bandwidth, all the cost, it is enormous. It's frankly a giant stone around my neck each and every year. But with your support, we'll keep going and keep growing. But if you appreciate what you're hearing, which I guarantee you're not hearing many other places, and you know that, then I don't care if it's $5 or $50 or $500. It doesn't matter how big or small. It all adds up. And we're here as a listener-supported organization. If you'd like to make a tax-deductible contribution, you can do that at WVW-Foundation.com, WVW-Foundation.com. You can also send a check using our mailing address. If you'd like to join our Situation Room, where we archive all of our programs, we make them available for free. Almost all of our programs. Not everything, but most everything. And then it rolls into our Situation Room at situationroom.net, and you can join for as little as $9.99. We're talking about a cup and a half or 2 cups of coffee at Starbucks a month, and you can join. And not only are you helping us, you're getting something in return, the membership to the Situation Room at situationroom.net. Those are the 2 ways you can support us. WVWFoundation.com, situationroom.net. And the 3rd way, pray for us. We'll continue our series next, Lesson 11 on Brainwashed America. Till then, I'm Brannon Howse. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.